Hey nerds, what's up? So, what's the deal with dead fantasy moms? We've talked a lot over the years about dead Disney princess moms. It's practically a meme at this point. It's probably even feels a bit belabored, but the conversation tends to stop there. We talk a lot about it in children's media, but not a lot about how it continues to affect fantasy in adult media as well. Now, let's be clear. I've covered this in previous videos before. The whole idea of a dead mentor character or an orphaned child makes a lot of sense from a storytelling perspective. Whether or not it's actually necessary may be another issue altogether, but we can understand how missing parents and mentors jumpstart a story. Our protagonist is forced to grow up, forced to do things on their own. We may see more drama because they don't have this guiding force. Although I do feel like we talk about this more, or that trope more, in terms of both parents being gone, and not why specifically it feels like the mother is most often the parent removed if only one parent is removed. If there's a single parent situation, it's almost always the father. And why is that? Let's take the example of 3 fantasy series I talk about a lot on my channel because they're the most famous and people don't yell at me for spoiling them, but Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Star Wars. Lord of the Rings doesn't have a mother figure in sight. Of course, we know that Galadriel is a mother, but in the movies in the original trilogy, I bet a lot of people don't know that and don't know who her children are. And she certainly at least isn't present as a parental figure. Harry Potter is famously orphaned. We can talk about the other male characters in that book later, of course. And then Star Wars. I mean, that's kind of the whole entire plot point, ain't it? Those aren't the only ones. The list of missing mothers in fantasy media is very long. So today, we're gonna talk a little bit about missing mothers in fantasy and why mothers tend to be the parental figure targeted more than fathers when a parent is deceased. We are going to talk about how this may affect our adult fantasy stories when the whole coming of age of a teen or young child isn't as much in effect, or shouldn't be as much in effect. And of course, we're gonna wrap up the day with some of my favorite fantasy mother figures. I'll see you after the jump. So why missing moms? A lot of research tries to point that this may only be Western ideology because much of our modern fantasy is rooted in medieval Europe, that this whole missing moms trope really came about because that was a Western ideal. However, when I really dig in, I don't really find evidence to support this. After all, the very first Cinderella story was actually written and originated in China during the Tang Dynasty, with their Cinderella being known as Ye Shen or sometimes Ye Xian. I apologize in advance for my pronunciation. From research, it seems that that dead mother trope has its share in Asian folklore and fantasy. And while it was hard to pinpoint down to just folklore in other traditions, such as African traditions, it seems like the whole dead mother thing crosses multiple cultural boundaries, especially in folklore. And we know that this trope isn't actually even a new trope. It was considered a trope for hundreds of years. We can actually look to how Jane Austen laments in her opening lines in Northanger Abbey in 1817. No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her born to be an heroine. Her situation in life, the character of her father and mother, her own person and disposition were all equally against her. Her mother was a woman of useful plain sense, wit and good temper, and, what is more remarkable, with a good constitution. She had 3 sons before Catherine was born, and instead of dying and bringing the latter into the world, as anybody might expect, she still lived on, lived to have 6 children more, to see the growing up around her, and to enjoy excellent health herself. Sure, that's not fantasy, it's just regular fiction, but I think we get the energy there. And of course, Jane Austen herself was guilty of the dead mother trope. In Caroline Devers' book, Death and Mother from Dickens to Freud, she says the maternal ideal in fiction thus takes its shape and its power in the context of almost complete maternal absence, and I would argue through the necessary vehicle of such a void. I thought that was a very interesting quote. That book talks at length about that situation. I have not read the whole book, I've only read bits and pieces of it, but I do like the concept of a mother was important in the void that she left behind when we talk about these storytelling traditions. Of course, we already talked about that void when we talked about missing parents in general, so let's dig deeper onto why it might be the mother in particular. I think as a gut instinct, we can understand why mothers are more targeted. After all, the word maternal is intrinsically and linked, right? The definition is linked to motherly. We associate the word maternal and thus mothers as people who are more loving, nurturing, understanding, perhaps forgiving, protective. They maybe have a child's best interest at heart. Whereas, particularly as represented in media, we may see fathers as more absent, distant, exacting, forgetful, neglectful, or out of touch. How much does this representation in fantasy actually reflect reality? How do we feel about these things being reinforced in media time and time again? If we look at data from the United States Census Bureau in 2019, it says that 1 in every 3 children live in a single parent family. 63% of these children live in a mother-only household, while only an estimated 13 to 20% live in father-only households. It is also reported that 80.4% of mothers are the custodial parents, while only 19.6% of custodial parents are fathers. I also found data that claimed that 1 in 4 US children live without a father in the home, and I wanted to compare that data with how many kids live without mothers in the home to see if they're comparable, because 1 in 4, 25% feels really big, but if we have nothing to compare it to, what does it mean? However, as I was trying to research, when I researched like absent fathers or missing fathers in the home, so much came up about the absent father crisis in the United States, all this data. But when I tried to research absent mothers and motherless homes, all I was getting was information about how many single mothers there were. There's even like an informational gap between the two. So I suppose that means, statistically, at least in the United States, this reality we're seeing in Disney princesses and in fantasy of more likely having a father in the home just actually isn't reflective of reality. Statistically, mothers are the parental presence in most children's lives, at least according to the United States data. But that same data may also explain why there is a perception that an absent mother is such a bigger deal. An absent mother means that the story can progress in a way that maybe it would feel harder otherwise. And when we are writing stories, it is necessary and normal to rely on tropes that we feel will help the reader understand things quicker or move a plot forward. I happened to read a very interesting article from The Atlantic that addressed this entire topic, and the author felt that there was actually a purposeful erasure of motherhood with sinister origins, that fathers want to be mothers and wish they could erase our role. I have to admit, I don't necessarily agree with this take. I do find the article very fascinating and worth the read, and I'll leave it linked below. But I did feel like a lot of her connections and examples were a little bit heavy-handed and maybe reading into it a little bit more than necessary. I don't actually personally think it's that deep. I just think we have a cultural perception that mothers are more important in a child's life or a bigger presence in a child's life. Thus, if we take them away, the child is going to suffer more. Or that fathers tend to be less understanding and more neglectful, so they can fight or have bigger drama with their children. Now, while in some way these perceptions can be true, just look at the data, I also think these representations can be very harmful. Obviously, if you look at the data about fathers who desperately want to be the custodial parents and probably deserve to be the custodial parents, but there is a legitimate and studied bias in courts against fathers and towards mothers, even when it shouldn't be there, that's a big deal. Now, I don't really have the capacity or the knowledge to attack those social issues in this sort of video, so I won't. But I do think it's interesting to talk about how these perceptions of fathers and mothers have seeped into society and are probably harmful in a lot of ways. Should we really be saying, yeah, fathers get to be neglectful and don't care and mothers always care more? Yeah, there's probably some real world consequences for that perception. But of course, at the same time, it also can be very frustrating to just not see the representation of mothers at all in media when they do play such a present life. Anyway, I can see like both sides of the argument. I just think it's a very interesting thing to examine. And I should point out, if we move on to different types of media, I specifically am thinking of children's storybooks, like children's picture books. Almost very difficult to see present fathers in those. It's actually quite the opposite. It is usually the mothers, all the cute kind of books, mothers as the caretakers. Anyway, all this to say, from the perspective of not having a mother makes the plot easier to move forward, makes kid characters in particular have a more reason to go out and do the thing. Like, I totally get it. I get why it happens. I do have maybe another theory to offer why we might not see mothers represented in media the way that it would be kind of nice, especially in fantasy. And I think that could be because we tend to ignore women over a certain age in media a lot. This has been studied a ton, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I will never forget an article I read a while ago charting leading men's ages with their love interest ages, and how often as the man gets older, their love interest stays the same or at least 20 years younger. This is a fascinating article. I will also leave it linked below to see the differences between leading men, but that's been a problem in Hollywood for a long time. I can think of several movies where the woman playing the mother couldn't even physically be old enough to be the mother of the child because they just cast younger women in the roles. It was something you'll notice that I championed a lot about the Wheel of Time show, that they actually cast a woman Moiraine's age instead of leaning into the ageless thing, and I was very happy about that. Again, not something I think we need to spend a lot of time on, but it is a theory I'd like to offer forward as a wonder if that's the reason. Now, in writing, it's a little different, right? We're talking about fantasy books where we don't have the visual component. Is it still affecting written fantasy in the same way? You weigh in on that. I'm not sure, just something I wanted to offer forward. Now, there is another side of this argument, which is, well, it's just historical. Historically, mothers stayed home with the children while men got to go off and have adventures, or men got to go off and try to take care of the family somewhere else. Like, that's just history. We're just reflecting history in our fantasy. So then it's like, okay, fine, but the moms don't have to be dead all the time, do they? And like, yeah, I know moms died a lot, but like some survived. And it must also be said, this is fantasy. Moms can go out and have adventures. Their lives don't end when they bear children. And maybe that is part of the issue of everything being rooted in medieval Europe. It can get tiring for that reason when we have to be in those static roles. But this is also something that has happened in my real life, right? That I'm seeing reflected in this fantasy. So, step back a second. I'm a mother. I'm a mom to 2 kids. And one of the hardest things I had to adjust to when I became a mom is people acting like I hadn't been a person before I became a mother. I got a graduate degree in engineering. I was a really type A person. Learning and education was an extremely huge part of my life. And then I had a career and I was a very type A motivated person. If you've been following my channel, I'm sure that will be shocking for you to find out. So when I had children and made the decision to take some years out to stay home with them, all of a sudden I'd meet people and they'd automatically assume that I had never been to college. They assumed I was uneducated. They assumed I didn't care about a career or work, and nothing could have been further from the truth. And it was really, even today, I'm a lot better now. It was really hard for me to deal with that. I got really defensive about it, like this erasure of who I was previously. And so sometimes it can be frustrating when you're reading these stories that just kind of automatically assume that erasure is there. These people didn't lead lives or cannot lead lives after they have children. So it's not like I'm desperate. It's not like I'm constantly being like, well, I only want to read a fantasy story that has a mom in it. That's clearly not the case. But I do realize how much I'm missing when I do get to read it. When I do finally get the present mom who also like gets to be somebody, I recognize it and like it. Anyway, I find this topic fascinating. I think it's something that we've looked at a decent amount in children's media, but not as much at how it bleeds into adult fantasy and adult media. I don't necessarily think that this is the answer, and I rarely ever do, but I do think there is some food for thought here, and I'd love to hear what you think about it in the comment section below. Tell me if you think I missed the mark on any one of these things, or if there was an aspect to this I didn't consider. I'd love to know. But to end this on like a happy, fun, positive note, let's talk about some great fantasy mothers, shall we? If you've been here for a little bit, why don't you guess who my first fantasy mom's gonna be? It is clearly Miss Saki from The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. I have gone on and on and on about how much I love Miss Saki as a mother character in The Sword of Kaigen. This is one of my favorite books I've read. I love it so much. And I love that this is the main character. It is such a complicated view of motherhood. It really shows a lot of the things I talked about. It shows a mother who felt like she had to bury her past life, and talks a lot about the complexities of how you might feel as a role as a mother. Also, she's a very strong person. The story is centered on her, and she's having her own adventure and whole deal outside of it, but it's very rooted in it. Just a fantastic book all around, and really just spoke to me on a personal level. What a great fantasy book. I do also want to talk about Brandon Sanderson. The funny thing about Brandon Sanderson is, I would say, especially in his earlier works, was a huge perpetrator of this trope. Lots of dead moms. But as he's continued writing, and I think this has happened in a lot of aspects of his character work, he has started to expand and realize maybe some of that stuff he relied on a lot. And so he actually has some other characters I really love. I'm gonna start with Navani from Rhythm of War, or the Stormlight Archive. But I didn't really feel like she came into her own into the Rhythm of War. Absolutely loved her storyline, and I love Navani's storyline in particular because she has adult children, and it shows how Navani is still capable of mothering, but she also has like a very rich other life that is separated from that. And I think that is very cool for her. Also, people have been surprised that I rated Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell, one of his novellas, so highly. I think one of the reasons I did is because of the mother character in that story. Really loved it. And he even explains in the foreword to that novella that he specifically set out to write an older female like mother character because he noticed what a lack there was in fantasy of that character. The next one I'm going to talk about, because obviously we have to, is Molly Weasley from Harry Potter. Now, she is not in adult fantasy. This is the one that's coming from, you know, younger kid fantasy. But one thing I do think is funny, if you go Google best fantasy moms, I challenge you to find a list that doesn't have Molly Weasley on it. She's always like in the top 1 or 2, which I thought was really interesting. I was like, is this proving how desperate people actually are, even in kids media, for the mother figure, like just like a good, uncomplicated mother figure? I think Molly is a great mother character for several reasons. Now, Molly does represent more of the character who is in the home. The story isn't about her. She's a side character. She acts just as a mother, but she's so loving and she means so much to the characters. She's such a representation of love, especially to Harry in the series. I think it's no surprise that people love her so much. She opens her doors to so many people, really kind of like the more typical representation of motherly love that I think worked so well because we do see it missing so often in fantasy. But yeah, I have to include her. I do love her. I'll also mention Essen here too from the Broken Earth trilogy. I mentioned she's not necessarily like my favorite mother character. I wouldn't put her in the category of these other characters I talked about who are some of my favorite actual characters. But I feel like I have to mention the Broken Earth trilogy because if Jemisin did one thing, she made a complicated mother figure and some complicated generational things. And definitely Jemisin has a series that isn't ignoring familial relationships or older characters in that way. And so I have to give it that shout out. And finally, the last thing I want to bring out, because I kind of feel like I have to bring it up, people are going to be shocked. So my husband has written a fantasy trilogy. I refuse to talk about it on Maine because that's weird. Like, obviously I'm going to be biased, so I'm never going to recommend a book I'm biased about. But I will say this. The way he wrote, particularly the main character's wife and mother, were born out of these very conversations we have had together. In many ways, a lot of the character actions or the way that they are written in that book is a direct reflection on these exact thoughts and feelings because we've been married for 12 years. So obviously he's heard it all at this point. And so I will say, like, that is reflected in the Threadlight trilogy. Okay, in conclusion, I'm gonna be honest here. I actually thought of the title of this video first, which never happens for me. It was a few years ago, I was like, what if I just said like Happy Mother's Day to all the dead fantasy moms? That's kind of funny. And I just never wrote the script to match it. So this was me doing that. This was me like, hey, I'm gonna research, why are there so many dead fantasy moms? Why is that a trope? I don't know if I've necessarily answered it, but I do think it's a very interesting conversation to talk about the disconnect on how parenthood is often reflected in media compared to the reality of what families look like and are. And I think that's a conversation that can be had much further out than just dead fantasy moms. But let me know in the comments below what you think about this topic. Give me your favorite fantasy moms in honor of Mother's Day. If you are a mother, happy Mother's Day. I think that's it. If you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.